Am I on? There we go. All right. All right, so we are in the latter half of the afternoon. We're going to have two general sessions, and one by John Eidsmoe and one by Israel Wayne. What I wanted to do was to encourage you in the next break between these two general sessions to, if you're sure on your book purchases, to go ahead and make those. We will have the book tables up for a little while after the final session, but obviously the sooner we can start breaking down the books and putting things away, the earlier that we'd be able to leave after the end, but I don't want to rush anybody. So I just was wanting to encourage you, and also I have been failing to mention that I have a book list, which is kind of in order of all the books going around the horseshoe there, and maybe could be helpful in you locating what a book price is. And all the books are automatically 10% off. And then as you purchase more, there's a greater discount up to 25% off. So realize if you look and a book says it's $15, well, it's only $13.50 if it's the only one you buy, and it could be even less. So I just wanted to make sure you understood the discount process. So for this general session, the final session that John Eidsmoe will be teaching, which I'm sure you've been enjoying his presentations, is going to be on the 10 Commandments and as the foundation for American law. So please welcome up John Eidsmoe.
Is it now working? Good. Okay. I said, when I was a kid, we used to go to the Saturday afternoon matinee down at the local theater. It cost 10 cents at that time. Saw some good westerns and so on. So I thought maybe we might take a little trip to the movies this afternoon. And we're going to see an old rerun that some of you might remember, the 10 Commandments from approximately 1956. But if you just went to the theater at that time, you probably didn't see the full uncut version. In the full uncut version, it began in a very unusual way. It began with Cecil B. DeMille coming out on stage. This is in the movie, of course, but coming out on stage wearing a business suit and addressing the audience. And here's what he said. Ladies and gentlemen, young and old, this may seem an unusual procedure, but we have an unusual subject. The birth of freedom, the story of Moses. The theme of this picture is whether men ought to be ruled by God's laws or whether they are to be ruled by the whims of a dictator like Ramesses. Are men the property of the state, or are they free souls under God? This same battle continues throughout the world today. I wonder what Cecil B. DeMille would say if he were to come back now, 66 years later, and see the way American society has developed. You'll probably see that the prophecy of G.K. Chesterton has come true, that either we follow the 10 Commandments of God, or we will instead be ruled by the 10,000 commandments of man. The more we move away from biblical law, the more we multiply laws, and the more intrusive those laws become. Does the Mosaic law still have any relevance today? Well, Paul tells us, the book of Romans, we are not under law, but under grace. As Bible-believing Christians, we're not going to argue with Paul on that. Question is not whether what he said is true. The question is, what does it mean? Paul says just a little bit later concerning the antinomians, those who thought that the more people sin, the more grace is produced. And since grace is a good thing, we therefore should sin more in order to produce more grace. But Paul says, what? Shall we sin more that grace may abound? God forbid. So what then does Paul actually mean when he says we're not under law, but under grace? Let me suggest several things that I think are parts of what he means there. First, we are not under the law's condemnation because Christ has paid the penalty for our sins. Second, we are not under the law as a means of salvation. We never were under the law as a means of salvation, but some of the Jews of Paul's day had distorted the law into a means of salvation, and Paul is correcting that. Third, he is saying we are not under the extra-biblical law, and besides the 605 approximate commands that we see in the Pentateuch, in the Talmud, and other extra-biblical works, many of the Jews had greatly multiplied those laws to include many, many other things. And Paul is saying we are not under that extra-biblical law. Fourth, he is saying we're not under the ceremonial law. The ceremonial law was, as a teaching purpose, a picture of Jesus Christ. As the Old Testament believers saw the lamb sacrificed on the altar, they saw that as a type of Jesus Christ dying on the cross for our sins. The ceremonial law is still valuable today for teaching purposes, but we're not under it as a matter of obligation. Another point we need to stress here is that when we speak about law, that doesn't mean that we are discounting the gospel. Law and gospel, the two are both important, and we need to remember the law cannot save us, but the law is instrumental to our salvation. One way of comparing the law and the gospel is to think about a mirror, that's the closest thing I can come up with the mirror right now, and a washcloth. That's the closest thing to a washcloth. The gospel is like a washcloth. The law is like a mirror. I can look into that mirror and I can see my sins. But it can't take away my sins. I can't see my sins in the washcloth, but once I see them, the washcloth can take them away. The law is like the mirror. The washcloth is like the gospel. Then we talk about the uses of the law today. Luther and Calvin both spoke about the uses of the law. Calvin spoke about 3 uses of the law. So did Luther, I believe. I say I believe because there are some who question whether Luther taught the 3rd use of the law. I am absolutely convinced that he did, and in Volume 3 of my Historical and Theological Foundations, I have a very lengthy footnote that I would like to think establishes that once and for all, but others have done so better than I have, I'm sure. But one use of the law we call the civil use, the curb. That is for the purpose of keeping order. We teach people the law, and we also enact it into statutes, and we put policemen on the corners to enforce it, to get people to behave and leave each other alone. In other words, the law in that civil use does not take away my desire to sin or my desire to commit a crime, but it will convince me that it isn't a good idea to do it because the punishment is so great that crime just doesn't pay. So the civil use of the law, where we teach the law to people to enforce good behavior, and where we enact principles out of the law into the codes of civil society. Second use of the law, the pedagogical or teaching use of the law, the mirror. What is the pedagogue? It's a teacher in a sense, but actually in a more refined use of the term pedagogue. Pedagogue was actually in a Greek household. It'd be a slave who would take these unruly kids in the household by the scruff of the neck and drag them down to the schoolhouse and deposit them there at the schoolhouse so they learn. The law, Paul says, was our schoolmaster to lead us unto Christ. The law shows us our sin, And showing us our sin, it shows us our need for salvation. As Luther had put it, in fact, we need both the comforts of the gospel, but also the terrors of the law. And he said, before you can comfort the afflicted, you must first afflict the comfortable. You have to first teach people the law so they know their sins. And then you show people the gospel so they know the way of salvation. And third, the third use of the law, the didactic, which also is another word for teaching, a teaching use, a use that applies to believers, where the believer, as he is in the process of sanctification or Christian maturity, looks to the law to see in the law the character and will of the Lord, and uses it to conform his life to the mind of Christ and to grow in Christian maturity. So we do see that there are uses of the law today: the curb, the civil use; the mirror, the pedagogical use; and the rule, the didactic use. Now we're going to see that there are principles of the law, principles that definitely apply in civil society. Are the Ten Commandments basic to American law? I will argue definitely that they are. And I'm going to first of all cite some of the principles that we see in the Ten Commandments that are really the foundation of our legal system. First of these is respect for God. We certainly see that in the first commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not worship a graven image. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. In these commandments, we see respect for God. And that is relevant to our legal system because God is the source of governmental authority. Every one of our state constitutions recognize that. Traditionally, Pennsylvania's constitution even cited Romans 13 as the source for that proposition. Not only is the respect for God being the basis for recognizing human rights, but we also recognize that rights are unalienable only if they come from a higher source than government. And what source could that be but God himself? Justice Douglas, in the Zorach versus Clausen case, that was a case involving release time for religious instruction, said, "We are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being." Now, Justice Douglas was, for the most part, a rather liberal justice. However, his father was a Presbyterian minister, and certainly some of what his father taught him rubbed off. He stated in a dissenting opinion in the case of McGowan versus Maryland, 1961, this is a very powerful statement: "The institutions of our society are founded on the belief that there is an authority higher than the authority of the state, that there is a moral law which the state is powerless to honor or to alter, that the individual possesses rights conferred by the Creator, which government must respect." Sometimes the view of law that we undertake in America today is called a legal system based on ethical monotheism. Ethical monotheism. Monotheism, the belief that there is one God. What does that have to do with law? Simply this: that if there is one God, there is one truth. And there is one truth, there is one system of law in principle. If you are a polytheist, you may well believe that Marduk of the Babylonians has one truth and one law system. Ra of the Egyptians may have another, that Zeus of the Greeks may have still another, Wotan of the Germans still another system. But if you believe there is one God, you'll believe there is one truth, and that one truth means that there is one higher standard of law. I didn't just say monotheism. I said ethical monotheism. What is ethical monotheism about? Ethical means that God's laws have an ethical dimension. You can look to the Romans or the Greeks and the god Jupiter, or the Romans, or the god Zeus, or the Greeks, and those gods will have various commandments that you better obey or else you're going to get in trouble. But these commandments are simply things that you need to do, hoops that you need to jump through in order to avert the god's wrath or to succor the god's goodwill and pleasure. The Hebrews believed we don't obey God's law just to avert his wrath or gain his pleasure. We obey his law because his laws are right. In other words, there is an ethical dimension to this. I could ask the question, are they right because God ordained them? Or did God ordain them because they are right? The answer to the question is yes. In other words, you can't separate God from his character, nor can you separate his law from his character. And that leads to another principle, the principle of sacrifice. In every other religion except Judaism and Christianity, sacrifice is done in order to avert the wrath of the god or to gain his pleasure. We think this god happens to love beefsteak, and so we sacrifice a bull, and as he smells that cooking beefsteak down here, then he's going to be favorably inclined toward us. In Judaism and Christianity, we sacrifice, including the sacrifice of Christ, not to gain his pleasure or to avert his wrath. We sacrifice to satisfy his justice, because God is a just God. Anyway, so all of that is what we see there, simply respect for God. You remember when the rich young ruler approached to Jesus? And nowhere is he called the rich young ruler, but we read that he comes running in one of the gospel texts, so we assume he may be young. We know that he has great possessions, so we call him rich, and he is referred to as a ruler, and so the rich young ruler. I sometimes just call him Richard Young. But anyway, when he comes and he asks, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Or as one of the translations says, what good thing must I do to inherit eternal life? And remember what Jesus says. He begins by correcting him when he says, good master. Wait a minute, you can't call me good master. Only one is good, that is God. Liberals interpret that to mean he's saying, oh, no, don't call me good. I'm too bashful. I'm too humble. Don't call me good. I'm just like everybody. No, that's not what he's saying at all. He is saying, if you think I'm only a teacher, you can't consider me good. Either I am a sinner like everybody else, or else I am something more than a teacher. When David brought me here, he may have told you that I was a good teacher. I hope so, but I hope he didn't tell you I was more than that. I'd like to think maybe he taught you I was a good example. But what if I was up here and I said that, there's one thing that David forgot to mention in that bio. He forgot to mention that I'm also God. Well, you'd probably walk out. You'd probably say, oh, this guy's a charlatan. He's trying to fool us. He's trying to get fame or wealth or something like that. That's not a good example. Not a good teacher. But then some of you might say, well, but he is from Alabama, and there's something funny in the drinking water down there. And maybe he really does believe this, in which case he's crazy. And as C.S. Lewis points out in what he calls the liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma, there are only three possibilities when someone claims to be God. Either he is a fraud, or else he's insane, or else he really is who he claims to be. So Jesus is saying, you can't come to me as just a good teacher. You have to acknowledge me as Lord, or else you have to consider me a sinner like everybody else. But then he goes on to say, you know the commandments, and then he lists some of the commandments. Interestingly enough, he doesn't list the first commandment, that we are to have no other gods before God. Part of this is the pedagogical use to show him his sin and draw him to the cross, but the rich young ruler isn't buying it. Rather, he says, all these have I kept from my youth. Jesus says, one thing thou lackest. And at this point, probably the young man is completely on the same page. He's thinking, this is right. He's thinking, I'm about 98% of the way there to perfection, but there's probably about 2% I'm lacking, and maybe this teacher can just fill in that missing 2% for me, and then I'll be perfect. One thing thou lackest. Go thy way, sell all that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven. And take up thy cross and follow me. Now, the way people teach that today, I find that preachers usually go in one of two directions. Either they will say, well, he's teaching that you have to take up the cross, you have to give up all you have. There is salvation by works, but we know the Bible doesn't teach salvation by works. Or else they'll say, well, that's what he said, but what he really meant is believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. But if that's what he meant, that's what he would have said, and he didn't. How do we understand this? We need to understand that Christ did not preach the gospel to the rich young ruler because he knew his heart wasn't ready for it. Rather, he is trying to show him his sin. And what he is saying here is, you say that you have obeyed all the commandments? Let's see about the first commandment. A lot of times we forget about the first commandment. After all, it might be hard to refrain from stealing and coveting and things like that, but we don't have any Buddha statues on our dresser or anything like that, so we don't have a problem with that first commandment. That's the easiest one to keep. Actually, it's the hardest. But let's see, have you really kept the first commandment? Give up all you have. The young man is thinking, that'd mean I have to give up these Armani togas. I'd have to give up my Lexus chariot. I'd have to give up my beautiful condo there looking on the Mediterranean, my seat in the Sanhedrin, all these other things. And he walks away sorrowful. He did understand what Jesus was saying, but he was not yet ready to follow that first commandment. And what Jesus is saying is, there is something that is your God above the God of the Bible. Well, let's look to a few other principles here. Respect for life. We see that principle, respect for life, in the command, thou shalt not kill, or more precisely translated, thou shalt not murder. And we see that making its way into the civil codes of all 50 states, and as far as I know, every country in the world. And so respect for life. I don't feel we take that back as far as we should. We should take it all the way back to when life begins, conception, but I think we've had a few steps that are moving in the right direction there. Respect for property, and we see that in the command, thou shalt not steal. That implies no theft, and based on that, we have laws against various forms of theft, and court cases have said that when Moses said, thou shalt not steal, he didn't limit it to simply larceny. He intended to include blackmail, and extortion, and all sorts of crimes like that that involve the wrongful taking of things. But some will say that doesn't really convey a right to property, though. All it does is mean that you can't steal from the state. However, when you go to the command, thou shalt not covet, which is closely related to the command, thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet is in the scriptures as a hedge or a fence. So basically what it is saying, not only don't steal, not only don't commit adultery, don't even think about it. And here we clearly imply private property. Thou shalt not steal, or thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's ox or his ass, or his house, or anything that is thy neighbor's. Clearly, when we see the coveting commandment, that takes the stealing commandment and applies it to private property. But we have laws against all forms of theft in all of our states. The basis for these laws is the respect for property that we see in Scripture. Respect for family. And we see the respect for family in the command, honor thy father and thy mother, and in the command, thou shalt not commit adultery, which until a few years ago, was illegal in all 50 states because states at that time recognized that adultery wasn't just something that might be immoral, but it had very severe social consequences. It could lead to uncertain paternity, non-support. It could lead to crimes of violence between people and so on, breakup of marriages, so many other things. It should still be illegal today. Respect for family, and likewise, honor thy father and thy mother. And the family is the basic institution of society. And we have plenty of laws that are based upon the family institution. Unfortunately, we also have some that seek to subvert the family institution, but that is not the way law was traditionally supposed to work. And another principle, respect for truth. Now, when I say respect for truth, we see that in the command, thou shalt not bear false witness. And when we say thou shalt not bear false witness, we need to understand that telling the truth is really a centerpiece of society. How can communication be possible unless we assume that most people tell the truth most of the time? If I'm not sure how to get here, why should I bother asking somebody for directions if I assume they're just as likely to lie to me as tell the truth? Communication, meaningful communication, is impossible unless we can assume that most people tell the truth most of the time. But then we have the command, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. And we think, well, that's talking about cussing, and yes, it is, but it is also talking about perjury. It is talking about any kind of speech that takes God's name lightly and brings him into disrepute. And hardly any type of speech can bring his name into disrepute than taking his name and attaching his name to a lie. These are the basic principles of Western law, and not too different from other societies as well. And they are squarely placed in the Ten Commandments. Luther said that God did not first give the Ten Commandments to Moses. Rather, he gave the Ten Commandments to all society. And in fact, in volume 1 of my work there, I have a chapter titled The Genesis of Hebrew Law, in which I demonstrate that every one of the Ten Commandments, which are given in Exodus, can be found in at least rudimentary form in the book of Genesis. Point of the matter is, God gave law to all of us. Luther went on to say that natural law is the Ten Commandments, that it was given to philosophers all over the world, but it was given in perfect form to Moses on Mount Sinai. And so, yes, we do see these principles of the Ten Commandments. They have universal application at all times and in all places, and they apply to our legal system today. And we've had several Supreme Court cases dealing with the Ten Commandments, and several lower court decisions as well. One of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever written was Stone versus Graham. Stone versus Graham was in 1980. In this case, by a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court said that the public schools may not display the Ten Commandments because that would be an establishment of religion. They used that lemon test that I was talking about yesterday, the 3-part test as to whether something is an establishment of religion, and they said that there is no secular purpose to display in the Ten Commandments, only a religious purpose, which I think would seem very obviously nonsense. There is the secular purpose of getting people to respect other people's rights. There would be the secular purpose of getting people to obey their teachers. The secular purpose of getting people to understand something about their heritage. Those are secular purposes. But anyway, by that narrow 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court said that the Ten Commandments could not be in the public schools. As the Supreme Court at this time is moving way off to this extreme separationist interpretation, I have to say that this is probably the worst they ever were. This is probably the worst of all of those decisions. Then we had very interesting situation in 2005. 2005, we have two cases that went before the Supreme Court, McCreary County, Kentucky versus ACLU versus Van Orden versus Perry, Van Orden being out of Texas and Perry being Texas's governor. In this case, by a 5-4 margin, the Supreme Court said that the 10 Commandments, as they were displayed in this courtroom in Kentucky, were a violation of the Constitution. On the same day, by a 5-4 margin, the court said the 10 Commandments, as they are displayed on the lawn of the Capitol in Austin, Texas, are not an establishment of religion. You have 4 justices on one side, 4 justices on the other side. The one in the middle that switches between them is Justice Breyer, a liberal justice, but one who sometimes voted his own mind and sometimes was a little more conservative. Breyer said concerning the display of the 10 Commandments in Texas that it was out there on the lawn of the Capitol building. There were many other statues and plaques and other displays. And just having this out there as one of those many plaques did not constitute state endorsement of the 10 Commandments, so that was okay. But as far as the display in the courthouse in Kentucky, that stood by itself. And so he said, by itself, that stands as a display of the Christian religion. Why he said Christian rather than Jewish or even Islamic, I don't really think he was thinking that through very clearly, but anyway, that's the reason Breyer said one is okay and the other is not. Chief Justice Rehnquist, in the Van Orden case, said, of course the 10 Commandments are religious, but Moses was a lawgiver as well as a religious leader, and the 10 Commandments have an undeniable historical meaning. Justice Breyer, in his opinion, said concerning that display of the 10 Commandments that they convey not simply a religious message, but also a secular moral message about proper standards of social conduct. And in certain contexts, Breyer said, a display of the tablets can also convey a historical message about a historic relation between those standards and the law, a fact that helps to explain the display of those tablets in dozens of courthouses throughout the nation, including the Supreme Court of the United States. I'm going to suggest to you that I think today we have a new ballgame on this issue. We have the most conservative Supreme Court that we've had in at least the last 80 years, the last 90 years probably, since the 1930s. But several things that we need to consider as we take cases before the courts today, likely that we'd get different results. First of all, we should not be prohibiting other displays necessarily. If we have a law that singles out the 10 Commandments and displays only the 10 Commandments, the court may say that is an unconstitutional endorsement of religion, and they may possibly strike that down. In other words, we should be available to teaching and displaying other displays, other historic displays, like, for example, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and others, the Bill of Rights, and so on, along with the 10 Commandments as being sources of law. I don't think it means that we have to give equal time to the Quran and to other exhibits like this. Not saying that we can't, but I don't think we have to, because they're not on an equal playing field. They have not influenced American law in the same way that the 10 Commandments have influenced American law, so they don't have as much authority to be displayed on a historic basis. Another thing I suggest is which version of the 10 Commandments should we use when we display them? Should we use the Jewish version, the Protestant version, or the Catholic version? Most commonly, when you see them displayed in public in America, the iconoclast or Protestant version is used, and yet there are other versions. For example, you look to the Jewish version of the 10 Commandments, the way Jews use them today. The first commandment is, I am the Lord thy God. We think that's an introductory statement. In Hebrew, which does not have that clear distinction between imperative versus declarative statements, they consider that the first commandment. And then they go on to, thou shalt have no other gods before me, nor worship a graven image, and then on to the rest the way we have them. In Catholicism, we begin with, thou shalt have no other gods before me, nor worship a graven image. And then they go on through the rest of the commandments. And then they come to number 9, thou shalt not covet. But wait a minute, that's the last. And so in Catholicism and in many Lutheran churches as well, they divide the 10th commandment into 2. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, 9, and thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's, 10. The explanation of this is adultery and stealing are separate commandments. So the command against coveting a neighbor's wife and coveting anything that is thy neighbor's should be separate commandments as well. And of course, in most Protestant circles, we begin with, thou shalt have no other gods before me, thou shalt not worship a graven image, and on through, as most of us would understand the numbering. Which numbering should we use? I suggest that when you're using a public display, don't put numbers on them. Just simply list the commandments and let people put the numbering in as they see it in their own religious tradition and in their own minds. Now, another point that I'd like to make in regard to the influence of the 10 Commandments is the way the 10 Commandments have been cited in American courts. Back when I was serving on the 10 Commandments legal defense team with Justice Roy Moore, and after those cases was over, the defense team became the Foundation for Moral Law, where I'm serving as senile counsel today. But something I'm kidding when I say that. But I did a computer search. We have 2 systems that we use for computer searches, Lexis and Westlaw, where you put in words and it brings up cases in which those words have been used. And so I put in a computer search of the 10 Commandments. And several terms that I used were Decalogue and 10 Commandments. I came up with at least 1,100 cases in which courts of record have cited the 10 Commandments in legal decisions. And this includes, they say, only courts of record, which means the Supreme Court or other federal courts or state Supreme Courts. One classic is the case Moore versus Strickling. Now, in Moore versus Strickling, this is an 1899 case in the West Virginia Supreme Court. It involved a state official who had been fired for soliciting a prostitute. And he said, you don't have a basis for doing that. The law simply says that you can fire me for a crime of moral turpitude, but soliciting a prostitute is not a law of moral turpitude. The state said, yes, it is, because it violates the 10 Commandments. Well, what does that have to do with law? Well, here's what the Supreme Court of West Virginia said in Moore versus Strickling. These commandments, which like a collection of diamonds bear testimony to their own intrinsic worth, in themselves appeal to us as coming from a superhuman or divine source, and no conscientious or reasonable man has yet been able to find a flaw in them. Absolutely flawless, negative in terms, but positive in meaning, they easily stand at the head of our whole moral system, and no nation or people can long continue a happy existence in open violation of them. I'm going to cite a few other cases that have used the 10 Commandments, and looking at one particularly dealing with the Sabbath commandment. Rosenbaum versus State. This is a decision of the Arkansas Supreme Court in 1917, talking about the justification for laws requiring rest on the Sabbath. The Supreme Court of Arkansas said, Blackstone says, For besides the notorious indecency and scandal of permitting any secular business to be publicly transacted on that day in a country professing Christianity, and the corruption of morals which usually follows its profanation, the keeping one day in the seven holy as the time of relaxation and refreshment, as well as for public worship, is of admirable service to a state considered merely as a civil institution. It humanizes, by the help of conversation and society, the manners of the lower classes, which would otherwise degenerate into a sordid ferocity and savage selfishness of spirit. It enables the industrious workman to pursue his occupation in the ensuing week with health and cheerfulness. It imprints on the minds of people their sense of their duty to God, so necessary to make them good citizens, but which yet would be worn out and defaced by an unremittent continuance of labor without any stated times of recalling them to the worship of their Maker. Daniel Webster says, "The longer I live, the more highly do I esteem the Christian Sabbath, and the more grateful do I feel to those who impress its importance on the community." Ralph Waldo Emerson, now there's authority that I wouldn't quote in a lot of circles, but Ralph Waldo Emerson said, and again, all these are being quoted by the Supreme Court of Arkansas, "The Sunday is the core of our civilization, dedicated to thought and reverence. It invites to the noblest solitude and the noblest society." Macaulay, "If the Sunday had not been observed as a day of rest in the last 3 centuries, I have not the slightest doubt that we should have been at this moment a poorer people and less civilized." And Henry Ward Beecher, "Sunday is the common people's great liberty day, and they are bound to see to it that work does not come into it." Interesting. If your boss gives you a day off, you say, "What a great guy." If God gives you a day off, you say, "He's a tyrant." Well, that's just one example. Many more I could cite in regard to the Sabbath. The command, "Honor thy father and thy mother." I'll give you a really, really interesting example here. Ryan versus Hutchison. This is a federal district court decision, 1940. I'll give you the year and I changed the page here. 1952. It involved a woman who had come to live in America from Canada and was seeking American citizenship and had secured American citizenship, but then she went back to Canada to take care of her ailing mother, and because of this, the Immigration Naturalization Service sought to revoke her citizenship. Federal District Court ruled on this, and here's what they said. "The sole and only reason for plaintiffs going to Canada was, as before stated, the condition of her mother, and the fact that her mother, who had no other children, had no one else to look after her, and she did not have sufficient funds to secure the attention she needed, even if such attention could have been procured by the payment of wages to someone to look after her. It was such a compelling necessity for plaintiff to take care of her mother as to amount to and was duress of such a nature that she did not and should not have resisted. To have failed her mother at this time would have been in violation of all the instincts of loyalty of a child for its parent, and contrary to the 5th commandment, to honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee," Exodus 20:12. The plaintiff performed her God-commanded duty to her mother, with the result that certain United States agents are now attempting to forfeit her citizenship in this country. Should such a dutiful daughter be deprived of the priceless possession of her American citizenship for doing nothing other than her filial duty? I think not. And in view of all the facts and circumstances of this case, I hold that plaintiff's stay in Canada was in legal effect involuntary, and as such, it could not be a ground for forfeiture of her nationality and citizenship to the United States of America. Another interesting case on the same subject. This is a case involving a woman in New York City who had rented an apartment, and in violation or possible violation of the terms of the lease, she had moved her elderly parents into the spare bedroom. And as a result, they're claiming that that's in violation of the rent and eviction laws of New York City. Here's what the Civil Court of Queens County in New York said. An interesting dilemma arises of a conflict between two laws, one written in stone approximately 3,500 years ago, and another written by mere mortals in 1962. The former is the fifth of the 10 Commandments given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and the latter is Section 52A of the New York City Rent Control Regulations. After he comments on a claim by the city of New York that the 10 Commandments were not a legitimate source to cite and not relevant to the case, the judge said, if we had eyes to see the whole subtle elements of thought which constitute the gross substance of our present habit, both as regard the sphere of private life and as regards the action of the state, we would easily discover how much we owe to the Jews for the 10 Commandments and other contributions to Western law. The public policy of this state, as expressed by statute and decisional law, is not in conflict with the fifth of the 10 Commandments. It is all too rare in these troublesome times of self-indulgence to find people willing to sacrifice their own comfort and serenity for the sake of their parents. Therefore, far be it from the courts to punish such devotion. Many more that I could read like that, but other cases that take the commandment, thou shalt not steal, and apply that command. For example, in Rocon versus Iberia Parish School Board in Louisiana, the Supreme Court there says, Moses in his Sermon on the Mount, by the way, obviously the judge wasn't thinking really carefully when he wrote that. Last I saw, Moses did not give the Sermon on the Mount. But Moses in his Sermon on the Mount established 10 commandments that have served the Judeo-Christian community for thousands of years. One of the commandments is, thou shalt not steal. Stealing and theft are synonymous and are criminal acts. For example, Moses castigates in those same 10 commandments, thou shalt not commit adultery, which is an immoral act. Yet to thus sin, one does not commit a criminal act. Au contraire, to run a stop sign in a vehicle, one commits a criminal act, but it is not immoral to do so. So this court holds that theft, especially of these funds, is an immoral act, based on the fact that it violates biblical law. Another occasion, the Florida Supreme Court simply said that the eighth commandment of the Decalogue merely reads, thou shalt not steal. Yet was it ever doubted that it prohibited larceny of all kinds? Well, on and on, I could quote so many more. I'm going to move on from there. I'm simply going to say that when we see the influence of the 10 Commandments on Western law as a whole, we can go back to St. Patrick. St. Patrick, for example, the monk who Christianized Ireland, coming from northern England and being part British and part Roman. But when he would travel throughout Ireland, he would carry with him a tablet. He would write these out, titled The Laws of Moses, and he would give them to the Druid judges. And then late in life, after mostly through Patrick's influence, Ireland had become primarily a Christian country, the High King of Ireland commissioned Patrick to lead a commission to develop a written system of law for Ireland. Before that, they had been relying instead simply upon the oral law of the Druids, and they would not reduce their law to writing. But the commission consisted of 3 Druid judges, 3 Christian bishops, and 3 lesser-ranking nobles. They put this law together, and as Patrick says in the introduction, we looked to the law of the Druids, and except where it was inconsistent with the Bible, we followed it. When it was consistent with the Bible, we just used it. When it was inconsistent, we changed it to reflect biblical law. And he says, and this is the sensus more, or the great law of Ireland, and that law governed Ireland until the 1600s, that is for about 1200 years. When Alfred the Great, as the King of England, and the first Saxon king to govern all of England, when he wrote the first written legal code that would govern all of England, calling it the Book of Dooms, dooms is an old Anglo-Saxon word meaning law or judgment, he began it with a recitation of the 10 Commandments. Maimonides, the Hebrew scholar in 1135 to 1204, in his Mishnah Torah, took the commercial law of the Old Testament and put it into the form of a code. And it became the code that largely governed commercial law throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. You see, the Pope had prohibited lending money at interest. Most businessmen aren't going to lend money if they can't get interest from it, because of commandments in the Old Testament that prohibited usury. But the Jews understood those commandments differently. As they understood it, the command that you are not to take interest simply meant that you don't take interest when you are loaning money to a disadvantaged person, the poor, the widow, the fatherless, the stranger in the gates. But if it's just a standard arm's length commercial transaction, you're free to charge interest there. That was the Jewish understanding of the law. So if you're a businessman in Europe and you need a loan, you go to the Jewish sector to get that loan, and that's governed by the code of laws drafted by Maimonides and based upon biblical law. We can look to Peter Cannaeus there in the Netherlands with his work, 1586 to 1638, the Hebrew Republic, which was called the most powerful statement of Republican theory in the early years of the Dutch Republic. There he describes Moses as the great lawgiver who was the first to write and publish laws so that people might learn what was right and what was wrong, and which sanctions might steady the state Almighty God had ordered to be set up in Palestine. Many of you may already be familiar with Johannes Althusius and his work Politica, which clearly is taking the Old Testament law and applying it to society, or Hugo Grotius in the 1600s with his work, The Rights of War and Peace. He's referred to many times as the father of international law, but while people look to that work, they wonder why he cites scripture so often in it. They fail to realize that his most important work was the truth of the Christian religion, which is really, many call it the first Protestant work of Christian apologetics. And there he describes the most ancient Attic, that is Greek laws, from whence the Romans were afterwards taken. But those most ancient Attic Greek laws owe their origins to the law of Moses. Blackstone speaks in his commentaries of the higher law, which he describes first of all as the revealed law, which is given only in the Holy Scriptures, and then the law of nature, which is also the will of God, but given by God through human reason. And he emphasized that all human law depends upon the revealed law and the law of nature, and no human law should be suffered to contradict these. We can look to America. In Jamestown in 1619, we see Lord Delaware come in and present a law code, the Articles, Laws, and Orders, Divine, Politic, and Martial for the colony in Virginia. It includes all of the 10 commandments with the exception of the graven image command, maybe because they were combining it with the first commandment. The Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which is 1601, based entirely upon the book of Deuteronomy. Dr. Aaron Shalev of the University of Haifa, author of a book called American Zion, the subtitle is The Old Testament as Political Textbook for America from the American Revolution to the Civil War. He says the fingerprints of the Old Testament were and still are particularly evident in the language of chosenness, that is, of course, a Hebrew concept. What has become known as the American mission, the idea that the United States is endowed with an errand to promote liberty, was formed closely in relation to the belief that America was the Israel of its time. We may disagree as to whether America is Israel, but that many in early America believe that and that it influenced their view of law is very clear. One excellent work, Joshua Berman of the Bar Ilan University in Israel, he has a work titled Created Equal, How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought, published in 2008. We think about created equal, that phrase that we see in the Declaration of Independence, a truth that we say is self-evident. But Berman says, if there was one truth the ancients held to be self-evident, It was that all men were not created equal. If we maintain today that in fact they are endowed with their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that is because we have inherited as part of our cultural heritage notions of equality that were deeply entrenched in the ancient passages of the Pentateuch. The idea of human equality broke from the thought of the ancient world but became the basis for American law. Eric Nelson, professor at Harvard, professor of government, has a book titled The Hebrew Republic, Jewish Sources and the Transformation of European Political Thought. In this work, he explains that the early jurists looked at monarchy. Some saw some good and bad aspects of it. But in the middle of the 17th century, he said, we find Republican authors, that not Republican with a capital R, but those who believe in a republic, Republican authors making a new and revolutionary argument. They now begin to claim that monarchy per se is an illicit constitutional form and that all legitimate constitutions are republican. This rupture, he says, was provoked by the Protestant reception of a radical tradition of rabbinical biblical exegesis, which understood the Israelite request for a king in 1 Samuel as an instance of the sin of idolatry. This embrace of republican exclusivism, the idea that the only valid forms of government are republican, heralded the decline of constitutional pluralism and therefore marks a crucial turning point in the history of European political thought. He says further, for roughly 100 years, from the time of Bertram until Spinoza, European Protestants made the Hebrew Bible the measure of their politics. They believed that the same God who thundered from Sinai and who later sent his Son into the world had revealed to Israel the form of a perfect republic. They labored with the help of their rabbinic authorities to interpret his design and attempted in their own societies to replicate it as closely as possible. In the process, they made crucial contributions to the political thought of the modern world. Republican exclusivism, redistribution, and toleration have all been defended on different grounds in the intervening centuries, but in the beginning, all were authorized by the divine will made manifest in the Constitution of the Hebrew Republic. I'm going to give you one more statement before I close, and I obviously have to come back to the law school where I'm teaching the Oak Brook College of Law in California, a distinctly Christian distance learning law school established to train Christian lawyers in biblical law. But our dean, Robert Barth, who used to be an academic dean at Regent, our dean, he had a law review article recently, and I love the way he puts this. If you combine the philosophy of government of our founders with the form of government chosen, you create a republican form of government that presupposes a creator as a source of inalienable rights and the definer of human dignity and equality. This form of government acknowledges the existence of a creator as a self-evident truth, and yet recognizes the distinct differences between the jurisdiction of the church and civil government. This jurisdictional separation between the acknowledgement of God as an essential presupposition of good government, unalienable rights, equal protection, due process, and matters of worship, faith, and religious practices is the essence of legitimate separation between church and state. What he is saying here is that when we display the Ten Commandments, or when we display those portions of the Declaration of Independence that say that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, we're not putting forth a religious statement. Rather, we are expressing a philosophy of government. The philosophy that government is ordained of God, that it is limited by God, and that God is the author of unalienable human rights. I think the future of the Ten Commandments in American law is going to be a bright one. And I urge you to continue to study this further. I can take maybe one or two questions before we close. We started just a little bit late, so it is 3:35. I'll take about two questions, and then I'm willing to talk as long as people want to stay around and talk. But what questions do we have? Well, let's skip the first question. I'll go to the second question. Who has the second question? No questions? Okay, well, we'll take a break then, and we are reconvening at 4 o'clock, or David, do you want to announce the plan? 4 o'clock, and Israel is going to have a message that we're all going to want to hear.